Hello, and welcome to another episode of Undiscovered Beasts and Strange Phenomena. Please join our experienced and knowledgeable panel of hosts as we explore the great mysteries of our time: Bigfoot, UFOs, ghosts, and unexplained phenomena.
Hello and good evening. Welcome to Undiscovered Beasts and Strange Phenomena with Adam Davis. Tonight we will be discussing the Almas, or Almasty, of Central Asia and Western Mongolia. Of course, my revered colleague and fellow co-host Adam has been on location conducting a personal investigation in this matter. So he certainly has a lot of insight to share this evening. And without any further delay, I'm going to go ahead and bring Adam right on into the show. Hey, Adam, how you doing tonight, man?
I'm very good. I mean, we've both been away for a few weeks because we've been in the field doing different things. I've been in an extremely remote part of Alaska, and you've been doing some exciting research. And hopefully, when we're able to, we can spend some time talking about what we've been up to, because I think both of us have some interesting narratives to tell. But obviously, tonight we're going to focus in on the Almas.
Yes, certainly. I think that's a great idea, and we both have been pretty deep in the field. You, of course, a lot deeper than myself, but. Yes, that's a great idea, and I'm sure our fans and listeners would love to hear from us about what we've been up to in the field. As far as the evening show, I can't tell you how excited I am about finally being able to sit down and have a conversation with you about the Almas, or Almasty, of Central Asia and Western Mongolia. Adam, it is fascinating to me the prospect of perhaps a relic, close kin, if you will, almost Neanderthal-like relative still in existence somewhere in the remote outback of Asia. Adam, can you tell me a little bit about the background here? What's the backstory, if you will, a little bit on the Almas? Because this is certainly not something that is new, and is deeply embedded in various cultures throughout Asia. So can you tell me a little bit about the background of the Almas?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think all of these cryptids that stretch from one of the reasons they fascinate me with these creatures, and it stretches from the Yeti in Nepal to Mongolia and the Almas and China, is that they have an incredibly old historical peerage. Well, what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that there are accounts of, for example, the Yeren in China going back to 600 BC. There's accounts in ancient Tibetan. And, you know, with the China thing, just to digress slightly, you can see paintings of a hairy man in their manuscripts, a bipedal hairy man. There are accounts in Nepal, in the ancient Tibetan shamanistic culture, which predates any modern religion, which lists all the known animals in Tibet and which includes the Yeti and even what it could be used for in recipes and medicine. So the point, I think, about all of this is that there is, in these parts of the world, a very ancient historical lineage. And with it, as well as those written accounts, there are actual eyewitness accounts which go back a long way. Now, how is this relevant? Well, if you're a historical archivist, you would use these accounts to understand the history of that time and quote, for example, a historian like Josephus or something like that. Now, what you are doing here is the same thing. And looking at these, thinking, well, these account creatures in places like Mongolia go back long before the advent of plastic Bigfoots or Yetis or anything else. And these people in these cultures were often not connected in any way with one another. And yet they are describing the same sort of animal. Yeah, there are different regional variations, but they're describing the same sort of bipedal creature. Now, could this be... one of the reasons I went to Mongolia is, could this be a Neanderthal? Could this be an ancient man? Is it just rubbish? And that really was my motivation for going to Mongolia, and there were other specific reasons for which we can go into.
Well, it's certainly a subject that will captivate one's interest just because of if it is indeed thought to be in existence to this day or even until recent times, it's certainly a very close relative, if you will. So that's something that really speaks to me. So I have a great interest, and I am also fascinated by this very long history. It seems that so many different cultures across Asia, like you mentioned, do have that common, bipedal, typically hair-covered element in their culture that is just so deeply embedded, it almost makes you think there might just be something to it, especially when cultures, like you just mentioned, that are not necessarily in contact, all have similar legends and lore, if you will. Let's touch on that a little bit, Adam. What is typically, like the prototypical description of like the Almas?
Well, this is one of the things that I wanted to investigate. So it's a poignant question because there were two, for me, strands of thinking as to what the Almas might be. And one of the starting points for me was, and people have asked me questions about what research I did prior to this and what books I read. Well, one of them, which was very formative, was a book by Myra Shackley entitled Still Living, Yeti, Sasquatch, and the Neanderthal Enigma. And I thought that was quite a poignant book because in that she postulates as to whether in Mongolia there could be Neanderthals still around. And I was interested in that as a potential subject. I'll tell you my conclusions towards the end of the interview, of course. But I was interested in that. I've always been fascinated by Neanderthals. I've always felt that they have received a very poor press, even now. I mean, obviously, Neanderthals, when they were described originally, it was a misdescription of the skeleton, which led us to this cultural phenomenon where they're often described as being stupid or having a distorted appearance. And they certainly did have bigger rib cages than us. They were more resilient physically than us. But they were also very intelligent. They had their own music. They had their own culture. And it's interesting to see how, the BBC, you can Google this, BBC, how the Neanderthals talked. Quick clip, which I think is very educational. The Neanderthals had a sort of high nasally voice, so they didn't have this grunt. If you met a Neanderthal, he would be more likely to go, he would more likely to go, hello, Mike, like that, with a nasally type voice than a, hello, Mike. And they were very musical, as I said, and they buried their dead, they had art. They were wonderful, interesting people. And I was fascinated with Neanderthals, and I wanted to explore and do a whole survey of that side of Mongolia near Kazakhstan to establish what A, the cultural background, B, could there be any traces of these Neanderthals still left, and I made a film at the time with National Geographic entitled The Last Living Neanderthal.
That's fascinating. Well, it's certainly basically what you're telling me is the Neanderthal was much more than just a stupid caveman. That's very
Absolutely.
clear. They were an advanced people, if you will.
Yeah, they were.
And that's something that a lot of people do find very interesting because they're so close culturally to us, closer than we might even want to admit. And when forced with the prospect of perhaps having to share our domain with something that's not quite us but very close to us, it might make us uncomfortable even in some cases. And I think perhaps our species might have kind of give their species a bad rap, if you will.
Yeah, completely. And so it was worth investigating for me whether there could be any stories behind this, and it wasn't something that. The film. I want to talk about the film in some detail because it's interesting. I think, because of how times have changed since that film, but also how the science has changed as well. Because I think it was like 2008. It's like 10 years ago when that film was made, and obviously I've done investigations all across the world since. But I was very, very interested in. I'd done the way I got into National Geographic making that film was completely by accident. So they said to me, I'd done something for them on the orang pendek. It was an Is It Real orang pendek, and they said to me, where are you going next? And I said, well, I'm going to Mongolia next, and that's what I'm doing. And they said, well, do you mind if we come with you? And I said, no, that's fine. If you want to come, you can come. I mean, what I'm saying, it wasn't instigated by National Geographic. This was something that was very much my own project that I was going to do, and they were going to join in if they wanted to. And I was fine with that. So, and I was there for, I think, 3 or 4 weeks. 4 weeks, I think. And they were there just for the short time we did the filming, probably about 10 days, off the top of my head. And it was so they were there. So my objective was to do that survey and to get to really understand what was going on in the country.
And you did, and you certainly did. And I'm going to ask you about that in great detail in a moment. This Neanderthal type bipedal man beast, if you will, is typically, often at least, reported as being covered with red to brown hair and having very prominent facial features such as a very prominent jaw and a very prominent bridge line. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, so the bottom line is if you saw a Neanderthal in a suit walking down the street, you probably might give him a second glance if you were really close, but he wouldn't stand out as being particularly unusual.
Depending on where you're at, he just might be, another one of the guys. Or...
Yeah. I mean, it certainly would look slightly unusual. Would have a greater upper torso and would be shorter, but nothing that would make you stare. You might just see him and think, yeah, a little bit unusual, but that would be about it. Normally, I think.
Well, when you went there to investigate the matter personally, and you got in country, if you will, what was like the first thing you did? I mean, how do you even go about doing something like that?
Well, I was lucky in the sense that I had established some Mongolian contacts. So previously I'd been to Mongolia. Mongolia is the size of Western Europe, and it's very sparsely populated. At the time, it only had a few million people in it. It was very, very sparsely populated. And I'd already been exploring some other cultural phenomenons in Mongolia, in the Gobi Desert on the border with China, the Mongolian death worm stories. That's a whole different conversation. Yeah. But I've been
we'll
there.
We'll be doing the show on that shortly.
Yeah. But I'd explored all of that and gone through that. And I'd established Mongolian contacts, which I could rely on, which were trustworthy. I mean, they took a year to establish before I even went to Mongolia in the first instance. We were very careful at the time about who we were going to use. I knew these guys, I could trust them. So I had these guys, and I had them investigate some areas. And I also cross-referenced not with any ancient accounts, with the more recent Myra Shackley book, which I've mentioned. And there was a specific strip of Mongolia on the west of it that I chose to investigate. Because I wanted to see what the accounts and the legends were. And just on the west, and it's sort of getting towards the border with Kazakhstan. And so that was my base, and I travelled all up and down there. And I met, as luck would have it, I met National Geographic at a place called Hovd. But before and after that, I did some travelling.
Well, let me ask you this, Adam. So the first order of business, before I ask you, was establishing contacts and getting and networking with some people you could trust and rely on.
Yeah.
Secondly, go ahead.
And all I was going to say about that is I should give a preamble to that. Is any of these investigations, National Geographic weren't paying me. People think, well, he was making a film, he must have made a load of money off National Geographic. I did not get a dime off National Geographic at all. So it's my money and it's my time, and I work to, when I'm looking at these cryptids, I have to decide whether the ecosystem can support the existence of them and whether there's any plausibility to it. And those were the things that I was looking at when I was deciding it. So I was doing it for my own research before that.
Well, that leads me kind of into my question I was about to ask is what made the western edge or western part of Mongolia appealing to you? What made you think that was like more or less the place to look, for lack of a better word?
Because all of the accounts predominate about the Almas in that particular area. Yeah, so and that adds credibility to it. So there wasn't Almas all over the country. Yeah, there wasn't accounts of it all over the country. Some areas had absolutely no accounts whatsoever, but there was a predominant concentration, both more importantly, I think historically, of the existence of this alleged existence of this creature in that strip. So, of course, and that's what your research is about. So, of course, I was going to head there. Yeah.
Right. It would just make logical sense to try to head where the core, most of the activity had been documented over time, including historical accounts, like you say. Can you tell us a little bit about the geology and ecology there? What kind of an area is that?
Well, some of the area is arid. It's very remote. There are very few people there, and when you get to the mountains and it gets greener, there's just nobody there at all. You can think of semi-arid pasture land peppered with mountainous regions which are uninhabited to any large degree. Going down in the far south, more deserty areas. That's generally it. It's sparse and barren, but there is vegetation at higher altitudes, and there's pasture land as well. But there's very few people, and the nomads that are there are with goats.
Yes, and the people there, just to touch on that, there are mostly, to a large degree, I'm assuming they are nomadic peoples. Yeah,
in those sort of areas, the Mongolians are nomadic. Obviously not in the city, and more of them are moving towards the cities like Ulaanbaatar with the expansion of industry and new economic opportunities, particularly the mining industry, which has really taken off. But still, I think roughly a third of the population are nomadic. There's no concept of land ownership to them. They just roam around where they so choose.
Right.
And they're extremely hospitable. Probably the friendliest people, per se, in the world. And what do I mean by that? What I mean is many of them live in gares, felt tents. And what you do is if you drop by, you can just drop by at the felt tent. They'll greet you, offer you food and water. Complete stranger. You'll tell your tale. You have a conversation with them. They'll tell theirs, and then you go on the way. And if you want to stay over the night, you can do. Now, I can't imagine you knocking on some stranger's door in America or where I'm from, the United Kingdom.
That's not going to fly.
No. Yeah, being expected in for a drink, some food, and a night's sleep. But that's the norm amongst that community.
That's fascinating. And now that leads me to believe that this type of peoples would be quite adept at living off the land and probably had a very intricate knowledge of the land.
Absolutely. They have to be self-sufficient. In Mongolia, the summers can be hot, arid and hard, and in winter, the winters can be brutal and very cold. And the animals have to be extremely resilient. The people have to be extremely resilient. Nothing is wasted. Every part of an animal is used. When I was there, we used to wonder what we used to call the meals we were offered, not disrespectfully, lucky dip soup, because you never knew what you were going to get. And I was like, every time my portion was there, I was like, oh, please don't get an eyeball. Please don't get an eyeball. And then if I see an eyeball, I'd be thinking, oh, no, here we go, eyeball time. And I just learned to swallow them whole, as much as I possibly could. Every now and again, the bigger ones you'd have to bite into and chew, but they were not tasty, Mike.
Yeah, I've looked into the Mongolian diet a little bit, and that's about the last place I'm going for dinner.
No, it's not good food.
That kind of makes me believe that if you was to maybe have reports from people like this, it's a little bit different than, some city slicker coming out there and seeing something and maybe misidentifying, some other type of animal or, something like that. You're talking about people that know all the critters they share the land with, surely.
Yeah, absolutely. They are part of the land, and they have to be part of the land. There are animals out there, for example, wolves, who will kill their animals. And they have to be ready and prepared and self-sufficient and know nature and animals intimately. Yeah, they're certainly not city slickers, and they can identify any of the species that are out there very comfortably. Otherwise, they just wouldn't survive. They'd be dead, or they'd be forced to return to the cities, or go to the cities rather, and end up in poverty. You're faced with hard choices. There's no social welfare in the same way as other countries. Right. You fail there, you end up in abject poverty, begging on the streets. So if you don't know your stuff, it's over.
Right. So getting back to what I was going to say a little earlier, with a harsh environment like that, if it affects the people in such a way, what do you think the hypothetical day-to-day routine is maybe for the Almas or Almasty? Are we talking about something that would travel great distances like the nomadic peoples, or do you think you're talking about something that maybe if it had everything it needed, you kind of in the area, it might hang out in a cave somewhere or something?
Well, we really don't know. I would speculate, and this is I've got to say we don't know as my starting point. After that, I would speculate that because of the nature of the ecology which we touched on, I think it would have to have ranges. I think it would range about in areas. There are plenty of cave-like structures in the mountainous regions, which I saw, many, many, many. And I would think that it would have to have ranges, and it would have to move around to a degree, but it wouldn't. It would have a range. So I don't see them. There were never any historical accounts of it moving all over the country or them moving all over the country. Certainly in the last 1,000 years or so. So they stick to particular ranges, remote regions where there are less people, I would suggest. But they they do have ranges, and they have to be opportunistic feeders. So they would have to be omnivorous in order to survive.
Well, I was going to ask you that in just a moment, actually, and I'm very curious about the possible diet. Now, obviously, there might be some habitat there. There's certainly a vast amount of territory for them to range in, and perhaps rarely, if ever, come into contact with humans, but with Homo erectus, if you will. But what is there really there as far as is actual forage or any kind of game animal that they might be able to take advantage of? What is there really to eat there?
Well, there's obviously lots of plants, yeah, grass, and there's wild garlic and things like that they could readily consume. There's an abundant plant life, but in terms of game, there's plenty of marmots, which are large rodents. There's hares, there's goats. There's plenty of game. I mean, I saw many marmots, marmot holes, plenty of desert hare. I saw. There are lots of potential foraging opportunities. And if you're an opportunist feeder, I mean, in our early ancestry, for example, one of the reasons we developed our larger craniums was we were carcass feeders. We ate the bones of animals or the kills, and you do have vultures there, and it's pretty easy to see where they might be landing and what they might be doing. So there's lots of opportunities to forage, but you've got to be resilient and mobile and be prepared to do that. I think one very important point that I quickly became convinced with is that if the Almas did exist, and I do believe they did or do, then I didn't think that they were Neanderthals.
I see. And of course, yeah, go ahead.
No, all I was going to say is, and there's a specific reason for that, and the reason for that is that a lot of the, and I'll give it you. Say you and I are out in the field, yeah, and we don't expect anyone around, and we're in a very remote place. Say, for example, like I was in Alaska a couple of weeks ago, when I know that there should not be any other human being within at least 15, 20 miles of me. Yeah, there should not be anybody there. Yeah, at all, because of the place I was, and I'll talk about that another time. And I saw a fire only a few miles away. I'd be very interested. And you and I might say, well, who's that? Let's go to it. Let's see it, investigate. Now, Neanderthals had fire use. Any creature that had fire use would have been made extinct by modern man. They would have gone to the fires. They would have found out where they were. Hunters would have gone to them. They would have either bred them out of extinction or they would have killed them. Now, Neanderthal, it's very important, to note that. And I want to come on to the DNA point in a minute. But Neanderthals, as a distinct group apart from us, I don't think can exist if they have fire use. There may have been cultural regression, which may have led to that being lost for survival purposes, but I don't think so. I think fires would be a beacon to extinction.
That's a fascinating concept that I've yet to contemplate. You bring up an excellent point there, Adam. Certainly, that would have been a raging beacon to call danger upon yourself. So that would not have flown. That would not have went over too good. Certainly.
No, you'd be doomed.
I'm guessing then probably what you're talking about is a opportunistic omnivore lifestyle where you eat raw meat, carrion, berries, plants, catching mouse, whatever you can do.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what you do. And that's no distinct, frankly, from most of the existence of our ancestors for nearly all of our evolutionary past, since we started to identify ancestors which we could either more cogently or loosely identify as human. That's what we did.
Well, when you got in country and you identified, kind of the area you want to focus on and got some contacts established, like you say, and everything, what did you set out to immediately go to any specific locations you had in mind, or did you go talk to witnesses more at first when you got it?
I think at first I was interested in going through the locations and surveying the historical accounts. So I wanted to go all the way south and then bring myself back up north towards Hov before I crossed the country again. And so I went to lots of different places. One of the places I was very keen to go to, for example, was a mountain in the south called the Mountain of the Almas. Yeah, it was the Mountain of the Almas, and I was fascinated to go there. So I wanted to investigate.
Cool. Yeah, I mean,
but
you got to go there, right?
Yeah, and you'd think, I was dead excited to go there. It was a long trip. When I got there, it wasn't that spectacular. I mean, it was a small sort of hilly area, but the people there had no knowledge or very little knowledge at all about the Almas. They'd heard that there were some legends about them, but there were no recent sightings, and those legends seemed to be distant memory. I mean, it was interesting, that there was a place described as that. So it indicated to me that they'd once been there, and that was the sort of tip of their southern range. I mean, otherwise, why call the name? It was quite clear to me that they'd been extinct from that place if they were there for quite a long time. Certainly at least the last few hundred years.
Well, and that's certainly a factor, and that's something that I was going to ask maybe as far as patterns in what you saw. Now, of course, you're saying you immediately got in there, and you're not some, Johnny come lately just came off the plane for a couple of days. Well, you're in country for nearly a month, and you're moving about. You're deep in country. You're talking to people. You're going to locations. I guess the whole time you're trying to piece together patterns. Is that correct?
That's correct. Absolutely. That's what I'm doing.
And I keep asking you about your investigative technique a little bit and your research approach, Adam, because I really have admired, your work over the years. You're certainly very well known and very highly regarded for your research techniques and investigative prowess, if you will. So I will ask a lot of questions from time to time about your approach and things like that. So after you got in the south and, it's the Mountain of the Almas, you think, well, that's a pretty easy one, but then maybe it used to be the Mountain of the Almas, but not so much anymore. What did you do after that? You went on back up north a little ways?
Well, I started to move up north slowly, and stopping in any small towns or settlements and asking them if they had any stories of the Almas and how credible those stories were. A lot of the local legends, there was a consistency in the local legends. A lot of the local legends talked about how the Almas made a woo or a whistling sound. And a lot of them talked about how there were potential abductions, and also how the Almas seemed to have a fear of crossing rivers or waters in any way. And I kept hearing those sort of stories, but I didn't hear any recent accounts. It was only in the area about a couple of 100 miles in a circular area around Hovd and also on the border with Kazakhstan when I actually got potential eyewitness accounts, stories of prints, herders who had heard whistling sounds and seen a creature, and of course my best eyewitness, Ulzi, who featured in the National Geographic The Last Living Neanderthal show.
Yes, and I specifically, and let's go ahead and touch on that a little bit. There was an interesting gentleman you talked to, along with your associate, your guide there. I believe the guy's name was Bill Gay, if I remember correctly.
That's right.
you had talked to an interesting gentleman that had claimed to have seen one on the side of the road, and you cross-examined him a bit at the actual location of the sighting, and you had actually mimicked a couple different types of locomotion techniques. And I thought his response to that was kind of interesting, the way he seemed to say it moved more down the ground like an animal, if you will.
Yeah. It was very interesting. I mean, let me say about him, I found him quite a credible witness. In the show, if you watch it, he doesn't draw very well. That's because he just can't draw very well. Yeah, he isn't drawing something with his skate. I mean, before I asked him to draw the picture, he said to me, "Well, I can't draw very well. I'm just doing my best." Yeah, so he wasn't a good drawer. What I found interesting about his about the pictures he drew was he kept it went with the consistency of the accounts I'd heard of people who'd seen prints. They described this particular creature, this one from the Almas of Mongolia, as having long toes, which I thought was pretty interesting. And yeah, what he saw, if you go through that description, what he described was a creature that was covered completely in hair and was bipedal. But when it was startled by his approach, it ran away on all fours like an ape. Yeah. So your point earlier on about the bipedal locomotion was correct. He was very familiar with all the animals there. He was a hunter. His job was to go out and, as well as being a herder, he had to know all the local animals and everything else. And he was absolutely convinced that he had never seen anything like this creature before, and that it was indeed a truly unique creature. And I found him a very, very convincing witness. I was very pleased with him.
Well, it was an interesting account, and I thought that it was very interesting the way he described it. Like you say, once it was startled, it dropped down to that very low, almost quadrupedal, get down to the ground and get the heck out of here thing, or whatever. That's very ape-like, if you will, in my mind.
Yeah, and I spent several days with him. It wasn't. I wasn't like, I wasn't there for the 5 minutes of the show. I mean, I hung out with the guy for several days, and I cross-examined him pretty thoroughly. Now, I'm not saying I can never be fooled. Of course, I can. I'm fallible. I'm a human being. But he didn't really have any motivation to lie. He was absolutely convinced that what he saw reminded me of something, an ancient hominid, ancestor in some way of ours. That's what he described to me. Yeah, this primitive. Okay, it's bipedal, but it's very basic. And again, I'd make this point. I've made it before, and I'll make it again. The notion that people had from very basically and sometimes badly taught science that we were just this epitome of evolution, we stood on our own and there was nothing else around us, is rubbish. And also science has moved on from there. First of all, we knew that Neanderthals were around, and then there was just them and us. But we now know for most of our ancestry, except in the very, very recent modern times, there were many different species of us, types of us, I should say, not species of us, types of us. There were many types of human. There were the deer people, the Denisovans, Flores, Neanderthal, many, many types. I'm not going to list them all, but there could have been up to two, and also ancestors. It may well have been that we were coexisting with up to 20 odd different types of human and ancient ancestor at the same time, for most of our existence. So if people scoff at this, they're just being ignorant, because the idea that these creatures couldn't possibly exist is just total nonsense. In fact, they did exist and exist for most of our history. The question is, do they still exist now? Is it remotely plausible that they do exist now. Well, of course it is. Is it unlikely in most areas? Then probably it's unlikely. But it's certainly not impossible. And anybody that scoffs at it is just ignorant, really. I've got no time for them. I used to want to evangelize, I think, when I was young, wanted to convince people. Now I just don't care. I'm interested in intellectual answers to questions which I know, and solving mysteries. So I'm not about converting people, but I am about getting good science about them with these things.
Absolutely. Very well said, my friend. And I do think it's important to point out when you have several competing, if you will, species, so to speak, in the same niche, what you end up with is one standing alone in the end a lot of times. There is such a thing as, cohabitation and the co-development and coexistence and everything, but a lot of times, either through warfare or just breeding or for what have you reasons, sooner or later there's probably only going to be one, and we just kind of won out. I think that's what's really important to make note of. It's like we're lucky in that respect, I guess.
Yeah, and one of the points I want to make is just a good example for people to show how science evolves, and evolves within a very short space of time. And I've already given one example of how our understanding of our own humanity has changed dramatically, with all these new types of humans that have been discovered recently, which obviously started with the Flores map. But the second thing I want to mention, and it's specific to the show. Now, Todd just tells on that show. I like Todd. I've spoken to him very recently. He's a very good scientist. But on that show, Todd says, because this was the thinking at the time, he said, did Neanderthal man and us have sex? Well, probably. We're not that discerning. Certainly, the male of the species isn't. I'm not going to talk about us, Mike.
Right. I know we have other things.
Obviously, we are, but generally speaking. And secondly, we'll probably, given that, was there any trace element of Neanderthal within our DNA? And at that time, he says no. Well, we now know that most people of European, with any sort of European extraction, probably have some Neanderthal DNA to a greater or a lesser extent. In fact, Absolutely. Up to 3%, which is quite a lot, really, if you think about it. But that's a really significant point, because that just goes to show how much science has moved on. So if you had asked Todd Disotell at that time, are we going to see within a few years people coming out and having lots of Neanderthal DNA in their system? He would have said, no chance. That's ridiculous. He would have dismissed it. But now we know that that's the norm, and he's very good at his job. It's not in any way a criticism of him. It's the fact that we've got better at sequencing and identifying DNA, because it's an evolving science, just like our understanding of our human origins are evolving. Our understanding of our ancestors are evolving. And our understanding of these very remote places and what animals may or may not have the capacity to still exist there is also evolving. All of those things are linked, I think, in some ways.
Well, it's certainly quite well established that Neanderthal, for example, was quite prolific and, scattered across quite a great range. And there were some places, even like in Spain and France, where there was quite a healthy population into the thousands, it's believed. So at one time at least, there was certainly a viable, thriving population. Now, what I'm going to do right now, Adam, is put you on the spot. I want to know, yes or no, if you got to put your money down on it, Adam, is there one more? Is it 0 or 1? What's the over and under? I'm putting the over and under at a half of Almas. Is there zero or is there more? Is he still out there?
I think he's still out there, but yes, I think he's still out there. I'm going to give you a longer answer if I may to explain what I think the situation is. Yeah, is that okay?
That's perfect. Yes, sir. You're right.
So I've answered the question by yes. I think he's still out there. One of the things, I mean, I talked to you. We've talked a little bit about how I did this survey of the western side of the country and went all the way across it. You know, I only really found any evidence which I thought was interesting of recent sightings in this area around Harft. And then there weren't that many, and it was in a specific area. Now, these mountains are very, very remote, but I got the impression, and it's just an impression, that this creature had been more common and more frequent across parts of Mongolia. It was still fairly rare, but it had been more common. But it had retreated increasingly with human advances and due to human encroachment, in the same way as great apes do nowadays, for example, with gorillas, and most specifically with the apes of the orang, whose habitat's been destroyed, and in a lot of places in Borneo and Sumatra, and is really retreating. And it had retreated with human population expansion primarily, rather than habitat destruction. And it was in this small area, and there were very few of them, and they were probably on the edge of extinction. They probably need to have at least 20 breeding population. I mean, I don't know how many would still be around. There's no way of me knowing, but, I'd be amazed if there were any more than a couple of hundred maximum at that time when I went, and, there's probably less now. I'd be amazed if they're... I mean, I think at the time I got the impression that they were just about clinging on, and there may be some of them there still. But, that could change very quickly. So I hope, with all of these things, I think it would be so fundamental to our understanding of humanity and where we are and what we come from and our origins, that I would dearly love to see one of them discovered. And I have no ego about it. I don't care who finds it. Yeah, I really don't. I would like it to be me just because I want the answers. But I don't care who it is, as long as we got some credible scientific evidence. I would like that to happen within my lifetime and or before they go extinct in some of these areas. Because I do think, as you know, that in some of these remote pockets, there exists a few of these creatures hanging on their environment by their fingertips. Some are more prolific than others. I think, there's still a reasonable population in Sumatra, though, with human encroachment and an expansion that could change very quickly in the same way as before on the fate of the orangutan in Borneo. But there is enough of them just within our lifetimes for the discovery of this century to be made. But whether that will still exist when our children grow up, Mike, I'm not optimistic about right now. I think if a discovery, and again, it's all conjecture on my part, and I accept that, but I think, the way things are going with the environmental issues, if we don't find it soon, then we're not going to find it. And that's I've always been, I've spent so much of my own time and my own money on this because I've always felt that the clock's really ticking. But there's only so much, I can do with my money and my time. I would have liked it to happen as soon as possible, but you have to hope. And I'll certainly keep doing as much research as I can to make that happen. And I know you will.
Yes, and certainly, if they're still out there, they're barely hanging on, basically, because if there was more than just a couple or a few hundred, there would probably be more sightings reported here and there, or something like that, or there'd be more, some kind of more tracks being found or something, a little bit more sign of their existence, if you will. And, of course, if you get too low on the threshold, under, 2 or 3 dozen, you probably start running into a gene pool that starts giving you a lot of problems. So,
yeah.
It's kind of like walking that fine line. If they're out there, they're probably just hanging on. And unfortunately, like you mentioned earlier, the human encroachment factor is a big negative, and it's not going to be good. And I think the very most important thing you touched on there, Adam, is if we don't find them in our lifetime, or at least in our children's lifetime, surely they will be gone. It's not a very good chance from just a common sense approach kind of standpoint. There's probably not a very good chance they're going to be around in, say, 200 years. There's just not enough of them around.
There's not enough of them, and also their environment is being eroded at such a consistently dramatic rate that I just don't think that they will be there. I think you've got these populations in a couple of small pockets in remote parts of the world that have been clinging on by their fingertips, I think, which are historically fascinating. There's been no real thrust by the scientific community to study them, partially because of ridicule, and I think it's a fringe activity. But really, when you lay down the criteria for analysis of a new species, they're no different from any other things. It's just, because of their very nature, extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof. But also, I think, as an inception point, even to start it off, you've got to have extraordinary evidence to even start a normal investigation, because of the investigation that is so synonymous with fringe activity, that it's very, very hard, and it's only citizen scientists like ourselves who can do this research. Scientists are now willing to test samples I gave or have given, but I'm very careful about what I might select. And in order to get that sort of gravitas, it took 20 years. It's not an easy process,
Well, like a lot of areas of our field of interest, DNA plays a role, and it plays a big role sometimes, and sometimes it plays the ultimate role. So perhaps, if not a living specimen, perhaps in the not-too-distant future, we can retroactively discover what we had just lost.
Yeah. That's an interesting point you raise, because one of the speculations that has been postulated to some degree is should we clone a Neanderthal man? Should we do that? Because we certainly will have the capability to do that fairly shortly, really. I mean, and really it's not that difficult with CRISPR. So should we do that? And there will be all sorts of ethical questions that people are faced with. When I think about the future, I think that two of the biggest questions for the next generation that they're not really prepared for, will be the advent of robotics, because robots will be able to do everything better than us very soon, and advance in terms of their sentience exponentially compared to anything that we can do or imagine. So what does that mean for us? What role do we have? Are we going to be like the Eloi with the Morlocks, technical Morlocks in the future, or are we going to find a role where we work in symbiosis with technology? And the other one will be genetics, and how do we want that to apply? So, it used to be that genetics was an expensive business, but it's not so expensive now. And, genetic tweaks can be made. They're already made to things like crops, but they can be made to people. So if you if I have a partner and she wants a blue-eyed baby, should I let? Would you say, well, that's okay? If I, and then there's social pressure. If I have a partner and she wants a more intelligent child, should we be allowed to tweak it so that we definitely have that intelligence gene? Then there's social pressure, because other people are doing it. Other people have got the intelligence gene. So do we feel social pressure? Exactly and then by the same token, let's bring back Neanderthals. Let's bring back the mammoth. Let's bring back dinosaurs. Yeah, let's use that. All of these changes about genetics and technology aren't like 1,000 years in the future, and so these are decisions that our children will have to make, and certainly our grandchildren. So you and I, in some ways, are on the pivotal end cusp of one different type of exploration. There's a whole new genre of exploration opening up, and it's going to go in ways that we can only just start to contemplate, I think, right now.
Well, certainly, technology is being advanced in many areas at an exponential rate, and genetics is no exception. And for those of you that don't really keep up with the genetics field, it's incredible breakthroughs have been made over the last few years, and our understanding has developed to the point where we can, like Adam's saying, we're at the very cusp of being able to, hey, you want a mammoth? Or whatever. That goes for Neanderthals too. And it brings up a lot of ethical questions. And just to quickly touch in the last few minutes of the show here, we don't have much time, Adam, but one thing I did want to touch on was Xana.
Yeah, and I thought that was interesting, because in that show they looked at Xana and Quit's skulls. I'm glad you brought it up, because it's an important point. Now, at the time, the skulls were analysed, and Todd came back with the analysis that they were modern human. Brian Sykes, the geneticist from Oxford, did an analysis of them using different techniques, and he came back with the conclusion that Xana was probably an example of an earlier migration, a relic hominid earlier migration out of Africa, and was a distinct, had her own distinctive features which didn't make her the same branch of our humanity, which was fascinating. Yeah, so that would again change our understanding of our origins, because it used to be the case that it was thought that there was just this one main migration out of Africa, and we're all descending from those. Now people are saying, well, maybe there were several migrations out of Africa. And now people are saying, well, maybe humans originated in different places other than Africa, and maybe there's examples of parallel evolution. These things are all very amorphous, and it's fascinating. They seem to be static for a while, and then certainly in the last decade, there's these massive leaps in our understanding being made, and things changing all the time. And if there's one point to get across to people today, is that science changes all the time on these things, and that's good. That's right. That's the way it should be, as we learn, observe, refine, hypothesize, test, and identify. And there's a vibrancy in all of these things. Let's just hope that this vibrancy is transcended down to these beings which are on the edge of existence, and we can prove them before they go.
I hope so. I certainly hope so, Adam. And again, that was very well said. And unfortunately, while we could go on and on about this subject, we're going to have to call it an evening for this evening. But Adam, I can't tell you how wonderful this conversation has been, and I really appreciate you being involved with the show. You're not just a great friend, but you're really a pleasure to work with. And I really had a blast, and I appreciate it.
Well, thanks so much, Mike, and vice versa. You're a good friend. I know you've had a very tough week, and I admire you for your courage and for doing the show tonight. Well done, mate.
Well, thank you, Adam. That means a lot to me. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening in, and don't forget to tune in next week. Good night, everyone.
Good night.